Welcome to this Get to Know Grails. And a warning right from the start, this is really entry level. So if you know a lot of Grails, this might not be the room you want to sit in. I will be going through the very basics of Grails and how to get started with a Grails application. I'm glad to see so many of you. Being at a Grails conference, it's sometimes having the beginner's talk is not the most attractive. So thank you for coming. Yeah, so who am I? My name is Soren. I'm from Denmark, but I like this picture because it was taken from the porch when I lived in Berkeley about a year ago. So that was a very nice view. I've been a Java developer since the year 2000. And in 2009, I started looking into Groovy and Grails and was very excited. And I've been very excited ever since. And now I ended up being a team member of the OCI Grails team. I also am a co-founder of another Groovy and Grails conference in Europe called GreatConf that runs in Copenhagen. So you can come visit Copenhagen in June. It's very nice. And I usually say I'm a nerd by nature. I'm not afraid of being called a nerd. So my kids think I'm a nerd too. And object computing. Well, we do Groovy and Grails work. We do some Groovy and Grails plugin migrations for the most the plugins that we find most important, and in plugin development in general, and of course the Grails core. And we are hiring Grails developers. So, the session agenda. What is Grails? What is in the box? What can we expect when we install a Grails distribution? What is the stack made out of? And of course how it works. And then the main part of this is going to be a demo. I'm simply going to build a Grails app from scratch so you can see where the components fit in and how they work. And you should, of course, ask questions during the talk, but there will also be a Q&A in the end of the talk. And as I said, this is not a deep dive into Grails. Well, it might be for some, but it's not how the Grails work in the very core. So let's start by an introduction to Grails. What is Grails? Well, Grails is a powerful framework for the Java platform. So we want to increase developer productivity. It has the convention over configuration. That's an idea that was, I think, it was conceived in Rails, the Rails framework. And Grails was, to begin with, a model over some of the same ideas. It has some sensible defaults. And it has some opinionated APIs, so it has an idea of how we should do things to get things working. So, and some will say that's a disadvantage. I think it's an advantage because when I get to a Grails project, I know how it's structured from the very beginning. Because controllers can only be in the controller folder, domain objects can only be in the domain folder. So I don't have to hunt around the entire project to find where the different components are. So it runs on a JVM, not a surprise. It has a very powerful object relation model called GORM. It has a lot of domain-specific languages for various tasks, configuration, constraints for domain classes, and it also utilizes the Groovy core metaprogramming, and it has some asynchronous programming. I'm not going to go into that last part in this talk, though. So what is in the box? Well, as I said, it has the object relation model called GORM that wraps Hibernate. But it also is partly database agnostic, so you have implementations for NoSQL and So that will be Redis, MongoDB, excuse me? Yeah, Cassandra, and there's another Neo4j. That's also one of them. So, and then it has a control layer built on top of Spring MVC. So, whenever we do a controller, it will actually, under the hood, utilize everything from the Spring MVC layer. So, if you're a Java developer with Spring experience, Grails will feel right at home. It utilizes Groovy server pages. That's a core technology in the Groovy framework or in the Groovy language. It embeds on Tomcat and Spring Boot. So when we run, especially in the development environment, it will start up a Spring Boot container and run the application from there. And it does on-the-fly reloading artifacts. So when you develop and you save your source file, it will automatically recompile almost on an instant. And then you can go, if you have a browser, go test it in the browser to see if what you've changed actually works as you expect. It works most of the time. There are cases where it doesn't work, but it will usually say so in the console on the output that if you change an interface on a class, it says, well, interface reloading is not possible. So if you implement a new interface, it won't recompile. That's one of the cases. And because it uses Spring MVC, it also, in general, uses the Spring framework. So it uses Spring dependency injection. And it has very good support for internationalization. Anyone know why it's called I-18N? There's 20 letters in total, and so the 18 in between I and N is the number. It also has a transactional layer, mostly for services, but our controllers can also be transactional. It's very easy to create tacklets. Have anyone here tried to create a tacklet in Java? Yeah, you know how difficult that is. And especially there's no reloading, you have to restart the container, and it's a nightmare, basically. And then it has a very well-defined plugin structure. That's one of the great advantages, in my opinion, that a lot of functionality you can go find in the plugin portal, so you don't have to write just yourself or wire up some Spring Beans or Quartz or what have you. That's available as plugins. Can save a lot of development time. And then it has a command line tool. We'll start out with that when we get to build our application. And the build system is based on Gradle. In Grails 2 and below, it was built on a Gantt, the version of Ant, and some custom built scripts. Now it's based on Gradle, and it's much easier to integrate and make multiple projects. But we're not going to look very much into the Gradle build. It's an assumption that it's there and it worked for us.
Still, grades package supported.
Excuse me?
The grades package command.
Yes, the Grails command is still there, and it for most cases it wraps some Gradle command. So we have a Grails command too, but we can also use Gradle commands directly to run the application. But there are some things that the Grails command can do that the Gradle command cannot do. So, what is the Grails stack? Well, it is running on the Java JVM, so everybody is hopefully pretty familiar with that. It does use Java and the JDK, mostly because you don't do Java programs without the JDK and the Java runtime. And then that's not a really good color, I'm sorry about that. It says Spring, so it uses Spring Framework. It uses Hibernate when you start an out-of-the-box project. And it uses Site Mesh. And then, of course, it uses Groovy. It's based heavily on Groovy, so that's one of the components you cannot take out of the framework. And then everything becomes a wrapper on top of the other things.
What is it?
Sitemesh is a weaving engine for your pages, so you have a layout template, and then you have your content GSP, and then it weaves the content into the template. And we'll get back to that also.
It's the engine renders.
Excuse me?
It's the engine that renders.
Yes, it's the engine that renders the HTML. So before moving on, I'm just going to shortly mention Groovy, because that's a very important part of this. I like this Wikipedia definition of Groovy, because it says cool, fashionable, and amazing. And that's what I think the language is. But if we go to groovylang.org and check it out, it's a powerful optional type dynamic language on the JVM. It does support static compilation and statically type checking. And if you are Java developers, the learning curve is really just like a small bump on the road, in my opinion. If you heard the keynote yesterday by Guillaume, you can take a Java program, rename it to Groovy, and then you are a Groovy developer for almost 95% of the cases. So.
Why are they calling it DSL instead of programming language?
Groovy can be used as a DSL.
So the domain system.
Yes.
So what is the origin? Domain is based on the domain objects.
Well, I think the best way to describe it is that if you have a configuration, that could be expressed as a DSL, and then when you pass it into Groovy, there's a builder that will take the DSL code and turn it into something understandable by Groovy. And I think it's easier to understand when we get back to going through the framework. There are some cases where it looks like ordinary code, but when you look at it, you say, well, that's not a method we defined. So when we get to that, I'll try to describe what happens under the covers. And at this point, I think I forgot to ask you in the beginning, how many of you have ever run anything in Grails? A few of you. And have you ever tried Groovy? And Java? Well, okay. We are on the Java page. So I'll try to be gentle. And the good thing about Groovy is that it integrates really well with the JVM and with Java. So if you have a Java library, you can use it in Groovy. If you write Groovy code and you include the Groovy jar file, you can call it from Java in most cases. Which makes it very inoperable to, that was a difficult word for a non. It makes it easier to switch back and forth. But in this case, we'll stick with Groovy, and I'll show you the cases where it's very different. So you get a chance to and check out groovylang.org. It's very good and has lots of documentation on the Groovy language. So there's a couple of principles in Grails. One that I like very much is dry. You know what dry is? Don't repeat yourself. Which means that we try not to write and duplicate code. So we try to write things that we only have to write once, and like tag libraries is a good example. You could plaster your view layer with the repeated code all over, but if you repeat code many times, it might be a good candidate for a tag library or template. So it's very easy to modularize your Grails application. The same goes with plugins. If you're writing 2, 3, or 4 Grails applications, and some of that functionality you copy from one project to the next, that might be a candidate for a plugin. And then you can easily write a plugin because a plugin has the same structure as a Grails application. So it's not hard to migrate a common functionality from a application to a plugin, and then utilize that plugin across multiple applications. And then you can say that's also what happens when somebody else writes a plugin and you utilize that. A lot of people find that useful. So when I create a plugin, I probably created it for myself, but I share it because I can see value in sharing it with others. Oh. Yes?
Is there sort of monitoring of plugins? People making malware?
Nope, but the source code is available. So when you distribute a plugin, you distribute it on Bintray, and they require you to have a repository on GitHub or somewhere else that's public. So you can go through the source code yourself. But yeah, in theory, somebody could place malware. Well, I guess that's the case with just about anything you don't write yourself. So that was don't repeat yourself. Then we have the convention over configuration. We try to write as little configuration as possible. If anybody has been writing Spring applications, not recently, but previously, where you had to configure beans by XML, you are going to love this, because here a configuration is, we're going to look at the configuration, but we're hardly going to touch it. Out of the box, this works. So that is a very nice way of getting started, especially if you're new to the framework. It's nice that you can install the framework and get up and running, and you don't have to worry too much about that to begin with. And as you get familiar with the framework, it gets easier to get into the configuration as well. And then it has some sensible defaults, so we can keep the configuration to a minimum. So, getting started, we'll start by installing Grails, and I'll walk through these few steps on slides, and then I will do them again because I'm going to make a program. I'm going to make a small application from scratch. And please interrupt if you have questions. We need a JDK 8 install. Actually, it also works on JDK 7, but there's no need to go on something that Oracle has already deprecated. We need to download Grails. We can do that on grails.org that downloads. And it's a zip file. We unzip it, and there's an instruction how to add Grails to your class path. It's basically adding the Grails binary folder. You create a Grails home variable, and then you create a path to Grails home-bin. But there's no need to go through all that trouble. I do see a couple of windows, but if you're running Windows, I don't know if you know about Cygwin. Good. Anybody that doesn't know about Cygwin? Or have a bash shell. A bash shell, if you have a bash shell, and you have that on Linux and you have that on OS X, and if you have Cygwin, you have that on Windows as well. And you actually have it on Windows 10, I think. I've not tried it. So there's a tool called SDKman. And SDKman is none less than awesome. Let me just show you real quick. You only need to have a JDK installed and have that on your path. It's called jdkman.i. Oh no, don't tell me I cannot. SDK. Yeah, sorry. Of course. So SDKman is a software development kit manager. If you come from the Node, you have Node Package Manager, and on there's various other package manager on Linux and stuff like that. So So the general way of getting started here is simply taking this curl and paste that into your shell, and it will download and install JDK man. And then on your command line, you have now an SDK. And it's a tool that will handle your various installations of Groovy, Grails, Gradle, and actually a SDK list. So it has all these various tools that it can handle, which is very nice. So in my case, SDK list Grails. You can see that I have installed. These are the versions with the star that I have downloaded on my computer because I've eventually been using them, and every time there's a new version, I install it, and I forget to clean up. So my directory with Grails installations is getting rather huge, but it will also handle cleanups if you ask it to. So if you have a Grails, or if you want SDK install Grails, and then you can give it the version you want to install, and in my case it will say I already have it installed. Otherwise it will go to the Grails repository and download Grails, unzip it, and add it to your class path, and have your path set up so you don't have to worry about it. And if you have multiple projects, you can switch between versions really easy of the Grails version.
Not a very
3 to 2 to 3. Can we look at that afterwards? There's also another option, and that is something that was just released the other day, and that is you can go to start.grails.org, and here you can define what you want your app to look like, and when you click generate project, it will generate a zip file, unzip the zip file, and in the, let's just do that real quick. There. Now we have a My App. Is that large enough for you to see? Good. And in here we have an application, and one of the things we have is this Grails wrapper. And the wrapper has a small jar file that will help download whatever is needed to run Grails. So you actually don't have to go and install Grails first. The wrapper will do that for you. So that's a very fast way of getting started without having anything ready for when you want to run a Grails application. So the command line tool is called Grails, or Grails W, depending on if you have the wrapper or not. But if you have installed the Grails application development tool or kit, that should be the command. And it will open a console-like application, so you can actually go in and interact with Grails directly. It takes a few seconds to start up, and that's because the JVM has to start up, and there's not much we can do about that. So that's also one of the reasons why they created the command line, is that we don't have to restart the JVM every time we have to run a command. So if we run Grails and hit tab, it will tell us the commands that are available to us in the place that we are now. So we can create an app, we can create a plugin, we can create a profile, we can call Gradle, or we can get some help. We can also list the profiles available to us, and actually, as you can see here, it's not only oh, that didn't work well. We have an angle profile, a rest profile, a base. The one that we're going to look at is the plain web profile, because that's a good starting point to get to Know Grails, and that will also be the default if you don't specify a profile when you create an app. So we would write create app, and then we will get a project structure that looks a little bit like this. And I'm not going to go into it here. I will in a short while, when we create the real app, go through what the different directories are expected to hold when we start coding. So it's demo time. And the demo will cover controllers, views, services, domain objects, scaffolding. So this is actually a pretty cool way to prototype an application and start entering data into tables without having to create forms and list views and what have you. And a little bit of internationalization. Look at some of the defaults and take a look at tag libraries. And hopefully we'll get to plugins. I have about an hour left. If you want to check out the code that this hopefully ends up with, it's on GitHub. But I cannot promise that that will be the end result for this talk, but I will upload the end result for this talk as well, because I am starting from scratch. I'm trying not to have a fallback, so I have fed the demo gods and make sure that they're happy with me, so I hope that they still are. So let's demo, and please interrupt if you have questions. So we are here in my folder. There are two options. If I write Grails, create app, my app2, it will create a directory called my app2 and create the application in there. You could also be in an empty directory. Excuse me?
If I install a stick command, Grails comes automatically.
Yes, it should. So, okay. Well, I'll help you after the talk, mostly because there's a lot of ground to cover here. So, I'm going to make a directory called demo, and I'm going to go into that directory, and then I'm going to run the Grails command as the interactive in interactive mode. So now, as I showed on the slides, and I'm just gonna as I showed on the slides, if I press tab here, it will list what commands I have available, and I am going to run create app. And since I am in a directory already where I want the app, it has an in-place option. And I could also write profile, see what profile do I want. So it has a tab completion for all steps. So it's actually very easy to figure out what's available to us at any given time. So, but I'm just going to leave out the profile because it will pick the web profile per default. But I could also have made a REST API or an Angular 2 app, but that will be beyond the scope of this talk. So I'm just going to write in place. It will resolve some dependencies, and if you have to excuse me for 1 second, I need a glass of water. So, it completed quickly. And there's some cleanup when you use the latest Gradle, but it still works.
What's the difference between create app and create app?
With
In place.
in place will create the app in the directory you are in. If you create app without it, it will ask you for the application name, and then it will create a directory. And then you have to exit the Grails tool, cd into the directory, and start it again. Yes?
Profiles are all stored in GitHub and have to be downloaded and pulled, right?
It's stored in it's a dependency. So it will get that from the Grails repo, just like everything else.
My question is, I work for a very secure company, and so I can't actually access things outside of the corporate repositories. If you're ready to set proxies and navigate these kind of things internally.
Well, first I would say that the Grails framework downloads a lot of artifacts, but I assume that you have some kind of clearing process for.
Yeah, we have an internal nexus and
So
so forth.
the corporate nexus will download the artifacts for you if they're not there.
Yeah, I can populate them manually, to even start to build on it inside the company, I have to do all that. But first, I need to know how to point to it.
So my mind thought would be clear your M2 directory at home, install Grails, install the application, and see what dependencies you have.
I tried that, but when I tried to build it, unfortunately, it worked, but I tried to build it back in.
Okay.
So I was wondering if there's like a proxy or something I could set, or like a repository.
You can install if you configure Gradle to use a central repository as a proxy, and that's simply Gradle configuration, or I even think a Maven configuration file will be picked up by Gradle. So I'm fairly confident that the configuration you have will already try and load your artifacts through your Maven repository, which is your central company repository. But if they're not in that repository, well, then you have to figure out how to do that, and I'm not sure about how that will be
I
done.
know how to fix that.
Yeah.
Okay, so
You need to fix the Gradle, because Grails depends 100% on how Gradle handles artifacts. Yeah. So I'm just going to open the directory structure here in, this is my demo. So, and this is very small, but I will see if my, this works. That work for you? So the directory structure is actually not extensive. Let's start here. Build.gradle is the build file for the whole project, and the Gradle properties holds information about what version of Gradle we'll use and what version of Grails we'll use. So after we moved away from our proprietary build system, it's become very easy to upgrade your Grails applications. You simply have to go and change the Grails version in Gradle properties, and it will know all the dependencies that Grails needs for a given version. Then we have the Gradle folder. It's just a caching folder that can be excluded when you submit to your GitHub or Subversion. Same with the build folder. That's the build artifacts. That's the output folder that Gradle creates. Then we have a Gradle folder, and all the Gradle folder contains is the Gradle wrapper jar files, and it's not really anything we need to concern ourselves with. Then we have the Grails app folder in itself. This is where it starts getting interesting, because that's where we have our Grails application. And one of the things that we have is static assets. That will be images, JavaScript, and style sheets. And I will get back to how we get those into our application, but for now that's just knowing that they're there. And right now it doesn't contain much. There's some few images to make our Grails app look nice. And then we have the configuration folder, and it has one folder called Spring. And in here we can define if we want to wire in existing Spring beans. There's one file in here called resources, and that's a little more advanced, but that is where you define Spring beans that you have either defined yourself or find in external libraries. And then we have an application YAML file. I need to get this. Where else? Yeah, the application YAML file. That's our configuration file. It's about I think it's about 100 and 150 lines long for getting your Grails application up and running. And then you have a logback configuration, which is where we configure logging. And that can be found on the logback website, how to configure that. And then for the rest of the folders, there's not much in them right now. Controllers is where we will put controllers. And domain is where we'll put domain. The only folder that's populated right now is
The logback Groovy is a new thing in Groovy or something.
excuse me?
Logback Groovy, is it a new thing in version 3 or is it available in version 2?
It's not available in version 2. Logback is version, Grails adapted logback in Grails 3. So as I was about to say, in here we have internationalization files. So that's the bundles for translations into various languages, if that is your target. And then in our init, we have our actually starting point of the application called application.groovy. That is what is run first by when you boot up an application. And then we have the bootstrap, which is called during initialization of your application, and you can do setup of various things in there. So, and then services, yeah, well now it's getting obvious, right? Services has services, tag libraries has tag libraries, utils has util classes, and not used very much, but it's there. And then finally, our views folder has views, and it also has a basic starting point with index and not found an error, and then it holds our layout. That's the layout for the entire application. And finally, the application has a source folder, and in here, since Grails is opinionated, it also creates test files for us whenever we create an artifact. So in integration tests, obviously hold integration tests. Main is simply if you want to write things that are not specific Grails artifacts. You can write normal source files in here. Groovy and Java. Java files go in the same folder as Groovy files and will be compiled in the compile step. So it doesn't care if it's Java or Groovy in the source folder. And then finally we have regular unit tests in here in the Groovy folder. So that was the basic application. It's not much, but the cool thing is that if you get to the next Grails application, it looks just the same. If you come from Grails 2 to Grails 3, it looks almost the same. That's not much changed at all. There's a few things that have moved around, like unit test has gone into a different folder and integration test has gone into a different folder, but that's a minor detail in my opinion. So now we have an application ready. So it's obvious. Let's run it. So we write run app. And even though we haven't done anything but to install and initialize the Grails app, it should get running in a few seconds. I don't know why it's taking longer than anticipated. That's odd. It usually starts pretty quickly, so something is hawking my CPU. There it is. Now it's running. So let's go to localhost and see what we have. So we have an application. It's not much here yet, but it does show us a little bit of information about the application. We can see that we're running in a development environment. I'll get back to that in a minute. And we can see what profile we created the app with. That was the web profile. And then there's a few version information about the Grails and Groovy and the JVM. And it also says that we have reloading active, meaning that if we create a new controller, it will pop up in the list of controllers down here, which there are none yet. And then we can see that there are no controllers. There's actually 3 services wired in already. I don't remember which. And there are some predefined tag libraries. And then, since Grails is actually very modularized by plugins, there's a whole list of plugins that are already available. Some of them are needed for running the Grails application, and some of them we can actually say we don't want. Like, we have this asset pipeline is one of them. That's not needed to run Grails. But if you're running without any JavaScript and CSS, it could be plain HTML. You won't need that. Scaffolding is another one that you don't need, but it's there. Caching, probably needed by Hibernate. Hibernate is one of the ones that you could replace with something else, or don't have it all if your application is not bound to any data source. It could be a pure front end that communicates with the REST backend, so you won't need to include Hibernate. So that was just getting started with the application. Now we know a little bit about the structure of the application. We could continue running in console but I find it easier to show what's going on using an IDE, and I prefer to use IntelliJ IDEA. So I'm just going to shut down the application here and switch to my IDE. Just going to copy my path here, and then go into here and say open. And into my demo folder here, and I'll just click on the build.gradle. I'm running the Ultimate Edition of IntelliJ, but it will actually import in the Community Edition of IntelliJ IDEA. Will import a Gradle project. There are some of the Grails features, like navigating between controllers and views, that are not supported in the Community Edition, but you'll definitely get far in that edition as well. So give it a few seconds to import my project with Gradle. And the first thing we're going to do is to make a very, very simple controller. One of the things the IDEA has is it actually has a console here as well. So we don't have to switch back and forth. So I'm going to use the Grails command tool again, just to start it up. And Now it's trying to index my computer. I can write Grails. No, Grails is already implicit. I will write create controller. So that's part of the command line options, and then I'll just write a demo. It's going to be a plain controller with no hardly any code in it. Grails will create a folder called demo, so it won't place your artifacts in the root package. It will always create a package for you. So this is a demo controller. Is that big enough? And so there's a notion of controllers and actions in Grails. So the controller is the class, and the action is whatever action we'll show on our URL. And if we run our application again, we will see that on the UI and the web browser, we now have access to one controller. And it would be nice if this was a little bit faster. So hopefully I'm not going to have to restart this very many times during this talk. I don't know why it's taking so long. So now it's running again, and we go back to this one here and reload it. And under available controls, we now see that we have a demo controller. And if we click it, it's hard to see, but the URL we'll get to in a minute is up here, demo index. So it's actually telling us that we have a demo controller and an index action. So by default, Grails will call controller action, and index is the default action. You can redefine that, but we're not going to go into that part. So, but how do we get there? That's actually handled by a class called URL mappings. And it defines that if the URL is slash controller name slash action, it will call that controller an action. So whenever we create a new controller, it has to be named something controller, and then it will have to have an action of some kind. And we can redefine the URL mappings, but we'll just leave it as it is, because it's a sensible default. But the reason that we had an error here is that it doesn't know how to render a result, because what Grails does when it executes the code inside the action, and then if it returns, if it doesn't do anything specific, it will try to render a view called index.jsp. So in this case, it doesn't know where to go because we didn't create an index.jsp. We could ask it to do something different. We can ask it to render a text called hello. And then we'll just wait for it to recompile. There. And there it is. Now it says hello. It doesn't wrap it in anything because it's not told to do a view. It's just told to render the text hello. So inside a controller, it doesn't look like much. It doesn't implement anything. At least that's not what it looks like. But because of the because of the convention, anything in a controller folder gets a lot of features that we just, well, that's where the documentation comes in, and we need to know what's in there, because one of the things that we have available to us is params. So if we go back to the URL mappings, we can see that we can add things to the command line like ID and format, and basically anything else like we would on a normal URL. So if I were to write question mark my param number one, nothing happens here. It still renders the hello. But in here, we have access to my param. My param in this case, if we want to render that out, we could just go into the params object and say I want my params. And this actually gives access to the parameters on the HTTP servlet request. So this is just a shortcut and helps us writing a lot of boilerplate code. So in this case, if we save this and have it recompile, it will, my param, not my params. It will render the number one. So now we got information from our browser captured in our index here. We could also use, Grails has a very powerful data binding, so instead of accessing the param object, we could also write integer my param, and Grails will do data binding between the params object and the method here. And how it does that under the covers, I'm not going to go into, because it's very, it actually just makes another method called index without the params, and then do the data binding behind the scenes. So that was, this is kind of boring, right? Render a text. So let's instead ask it to render a GSP file, and we can just create one here. And this is how a GSP file looks. So we would imagine that when we render this, it will be a plain white page, right? Because there's no text, there's no nothing in here. So when we go back to our browser here and render this, it actually becomes a very nice page. It still doesn't have any content because we didn't add any content in our page, but we got from this plain page to a nice looking HTML page with headers and graphics and everything. So Grails uses site mesh, and it merges the content of this page into a template. The template is in the views layout folder called main, and here we actually see that it's a little more advanced. It includes some style sheeting. It has some navigation menu, and it has a footer and some other stuff. And this is where everything gets weaved in. And the short version is that everything that's in the header in our GSP page here is extracted and put into our layout here. And everything that is in our body in our page here, we could just say h1 hello world. And go here. Oh, I put it in before the body, then it, of course it doesn't work. There. So, and that is weaved in where it says layout body. And actually, it also has the option to take a page element and take it out of the original context and place it somewhere else. So in this case, they have created an option for making menus, so that menu will be moved over on the top right. So if we make a content tag equals nav, and then let make an li and an href. Make my menu item, that will go over here. So it can take page elements and move them around from the layout perspective. Yes. Then we go back to our controller. Right now, we don't put anything from the controller layer back into the view. Right now, the static content in the view. But imagine that we have something that we want to present to the user. That could be a name, G3 Summit. So that is now the return value. So this is actually, when we return a map, this is a Groovy map. When we return a map, that gets turned into the model for the view. So everything that we put in the model will be accessible in our view. So in the view, we can go in and say hello, and then instead of world, we can access whatever's in the model, and we'll do that by Groovy's what's it called?
Which file is this?
Control.
Excuse me?
Which file is this?
That's index.jsp. It's by convention. It's placed in here in views, and then it's placed in a folder that follows the controller name called demo, and then it has a name that is called index, which follows the action name. So again, it's the convention. So we don't have to worry so much about, as long as we get the naming aligned, we don't have to write that it has to return the view index, because that's a default thing. We can tell it to render another view if we have to, but per default it will render the view that follows the name of the action. So in here we'll use Groovy the string interpolation. So we can just write name here, and now when we go in here, it will take the string that we provided in the model and place it in the view. So Grails is good for rendering HTML, but it's also very easy to render things like XML and JSON for if you have a single page application and stuff like that, or if you have an API that you want to deliver data to. And right now we just return the model, but Grails provides a method called respond, and it will respond the model, and it will look at information about, it will look at the request header and see what the client requests, what kind of data the client requests. So in case we have a need for JSON instead, we can write JSON, and it will render JSON instead. Or if we want to render XML, we can just write .xml, and it will render the same model as XML instead. So it's a very powerful way of getting data without having to write very much code, because the respond method in Grails will take care of all the content negotiation for us. Okay, so that was a little bit about the controller layer. I'm going to go very, very shortly into the service layer. Service layer will be where you put everything you have to do is transactional and business logic. Yeah, just looking for the word. So you put business logic in services and not. Usually try to keep your controllers as narrow as possible so you don't have too much logic in there. At least that's my opinion. Of course you can put everything in your controller, but it'll be easier to maintain and definitely easier to test if you use a service. So let's, in here, in our Grails command line, down here, right, create service demo. And it will create a demo service, and it will also create a source file for my tests. So it will actually already have a demo controller spec where it will fail per default, which is good. And you have a demo service. And the thing is, you can see up here it says test for demo service, which means that Grails will know that now we're testing a service. So in our expect block here, it uses Spark for testing. And in our expect block here, we will actually have access to our service. And our service has one service method. So we could say that our service method, we expect that to return G3 summit, just for trials. And then if we run this demo service test, we should of course get a failed test. And while that runs, let's look at how the service looks. So the service is, it will implement, it will be annotated transactional. So per default, if you start using this and you do anything that has to do with the database, it will be in a transaction. We could also remove the transactional, and then the service will be a non-transactional service. As you can see, the test fails. It says that expected the G3 summit on here. It's there. I expected G3 summit, but it returned null. So let's just make something that returns a G3 summit. Like that. Just, it's always nice to have a test that passes. But Grails makes sure that every time you make an artifact, it also makes a test to go with it. So to kindly remind you that you should test your code. And actually Grails, in my opinion, makes it very easy to test your code. So now that we have a service that returns G3 summit, we need to find a way to use that in our controller. And Grails uses Spring dependency injection. And it does that, so you can simply define my demo service like this. And now if that's a Spring bean, we can see that in the idea that it knows about that being an injected Spring bean here. And then we can go in here and say we want to use the service, and then call the, what was the method? Demo service, that's why. Service method. I'm not going to rename that, but I could. So now whenever I run my application here, and I go to, now you can see that it returned with a dash instead of nothing. So it called my service. So now I have a service layer and a controller layer. Okay, we haven't touched the domain layer yet, and that's actually a very interesting part of Grails, but I figured that it was nice to know how the demo layer, the controller layer was built first before we do a deeper dive into domains. So let's make a domain class. later today, I'm doing a tour de plugin where I go through a lot of plugins. So for that notion, I have a cycling team and writers. So I'm just going to reuse that idea here. So because it will show you a relation between the two domain objects. But let's start by making a team. We can write here in our console again, create domain class, and then make a team. So again, it has a command line for create domain class, and then name it team. And again, it will look, I haven't specified what package I want it in. If I specify a full package structure, it will create that package structure for me and create the class. So I'm creating a team. So under my domain folder here, I now have a team class, and as you can see, again, it's fairly plain. It's a class. It doesn't implement anything. It's not annotated with anything. But under the hood, since it's in the Grails domain folder, it gets a lot of properties for domain classes like save and get and find and list and delete. And I'm going to add 2 properties for it, and I'm going to use the Groovy properties. Only thing I need to do is create a string, and let's say it has a name, string, description. So it's spelled wrong, it's not referenced, that's why. So, and then we have the constraints block, and that's where we hit the first DSL. So this code in the constraint block is not executed as normal code. So it's executed by a DSL runner for Grails domain classes. And what you can specify in here is constraints for your domain class. And a constraint could be that our description, we don't care if it contains a value or not, so it can be nullable. So we can say that it's a nullable here, and that's true. By default, all properties in a domain instance will be nullable false, which means that in the database, it will be not null. So the column that is created in our database will be not null unless we specified nullable equals true or true. And also, another thing I would like for this description, that per default, anything that's created as a string will have the length of 255 characters in a database. So it will be a varchar 250. I would like it to be, let's say, 6,000 characters. So I could say max size 6,000. And so these can, of course, be very hard to remember from the top of your head. But if you look at docs.grails.org, you'll find a very, very extensive and very good documentation. So here you have a lot of chapters with everything you need to know about Grails. And over here you have a quick reference. And one of the things that we're looking at right now is constraints. So I'm going to use max size. So you can say something has a max size. And it also tells you that in this case, when it creates, it uses Hibernate under the hoods. And Hibernate automatically knows how to create tables in your database when you start the application. And it will tell you that this one inflicts the schema definition. So that will actually be a varchar 6,000. It's probably a little bit expensive database-wise to make a varchar that large. We can also control the mappings. So if we look here, there's also an option to do database mapping for our domain objects. And I will get back to that in a little bit. So let's just our ID. I am just going to shortly stop my application because I want to show you that we have another way of interacting with Grails. It's called the console. So I'm writing console instead. And that will actually start a Groovy console. So if you have Groovy on your command line, you can write Groovy console, and it will start a small application where you can write code and execute it right away. And Grails has taken that console and wired it into our application. So in a short while, it should start up. There it is. And here I can write, first I have to import my demo folder so I have my artifacts available. And then I could write team, and when we look at the team here, we can see there's no methods on it, right? But because it's in the Grails domain folder, it has a lot of methods added onto it. So I could do count. So now I can get the count of team instances in my database. Not surprisingly, there's no one because I haven't created one, but let's create one. New team, name, Saxo. I think there's a team called that. And when I create that and run it, you can see I get a demo team, and it says unsaved because I didn't call the save method on the domain class. But if I call save, or I could first let's start by another thing. We can validate our objects. So as you remember here, it sets constraint for description is nullable true, but it also says implicit that the name is nullable false. So if I create this and validate it, and if I could spell right, it will say it's not valid, which means that if we split this up into a few lines, and we have a team, and then we have team validate, and that returned false. And now we can actually ask the domain object, okay, it didn't validate. What errors do we have on our object? So we can say errors. Again, that's not a property on the domain class itself, but that's added by Grails. So it says, okay, the field demo team field name rejected value null because it cannot be null. And that could be used for displaying in the UI. So Grails will not save anything to the database that's not validatable. So we do not get the error from our database. We get them before that. So let's name this one. And when we call validate this time, missed the colon. There we go. It says no validation errors. So now that it's valid, let's save it. And when we save it, we can see now we have now it got an ID, and that ID, we don't see that in our domain object either, but Grails will decorate any domain object with a long for the ID and a version for versioning optimistic locking. So if you pull up a domain object in your UI, it also has a version, and when you save it, you can check if the version in the database was the same as when you loaded it up. And if it isn't, you will do some help for the user to not override somebody else's changes. Okay. But running it in the console can be a little bit tedious, so let's go back and run. Oh, no, I stopped my Grails. That was not my intention. So we have the team, and we want to be able to interact with that in our UI. And the easiest way to interact with a domain object in our UI when we start developing stuff is using the scaffolded views in Grails. So that is a controller that contains almost no information, but it contains the information that it should create everything we need to interact with our domain object. So as soon as my application is started, I will go ahead and create a scaffolded controller. And while it does that, I am going to make a small detour. No, let's just make the scaffolded controller first. Create scaffold controller, and then demo.demo. I'm just going to tell it what package I can find my create scaffold controller, demo.demo, so what package and what domain object I want the scaffold to happen on. Oh, not demo, sorry, team, of course. Now it created a scaffold controller for me, and when we go into our folder here, we can now see that we have a team controller, and all it contains is one static variable, say that it should scaffold team. So let's go to the UI and see what we got. Back to our Grails app here. And here you can see that we have a team controller now. And if I click that, I actually get a very nice UI. And I can go in and I can make a new team. And if I click create here, it also has validation brought all the way out to the UI. So it's actually, this is HTML, it has a required field. So if I don't enter anything here, that's the reason why it says fill out this field. So I could write and it will save it to my database. And the Grails even have built in a database console, so we can go into localhost DB console here, and that's available when you run in development mode. So when you connect to this, you can actually see what the database table looks like. So it has a team, it has an ID, version, and description and name. So and if we simply run this here, we we get the database, we get the data that we just entered into our database. So that's a nice helpful tool. And what Grails does is it runs everything in an in-memory database called H2. So it's very easy to configure your databases in Grails in general. If we go into the config folder and open up our application YAML file, you can see down here it has data sources, and it even supports various environments. So right now we are running in a development environment, and that has a data source that is a runs an H2 driver in memory. And the same happens if you run it in test environment. But if you run it in production environment, in this case, it will create a file-based database. So that will be persistent. And of course, you can interchange this with any Oracle, MySQL, Postgres database URL, whatever you want. That's all configurable from this file. So we have a scaffolded team controller, and we can enter data into it. And of course, it's called, the base URL is called DB console. And we're running out of time here, unfortunately. So that was a team. Now we need the writers. So let me quickly create a domain class demo writer, and let's wire those two up. So I created in the demo folder now. Here we have a writer, and again it's empty. So to save some time here, I have a snippet here. Let's see, domain classes. So I'm just going to copy this so we can get going. I could type it in, but so as you can see here, we still have string properties, but now I also have an integer property called weight and a property called born. I could also implement toString. So as you saw when we got the team, it would say team:1. That's a call to toString, and the default implementation will tell you what the domain class is and what index it has in the database. But I could override that by creating my own implementation of toString, and then we'll return that. And the final thing you see here is that it belongs to a team. So now we have the one direction in our bidirectional one-to-many. So, but the team also needs to know what writers it has. And that is equally as easy to define. We simply say static has many, and then we tell it what it has many of, and we say it has writers, and then we tell it what type it is. So now we have a bidirectional one-to-many mapping. So one team has many writers. So let's first look at the database. Oops, not that. And sometimes it reloads and sometimes it does not. So let's not spend too much time here. We'll just stop our application and then start it again and run it. And as you'll see in a few seconds, it now has more fields that defines how they are linked together. And I would like to fill in some data into this. So again, I have a small file on my file system. So as I said earlier, we have this bootstrap notion that runs every time our Grails application runs. And I'm just going to put in some code that will populate my my database, so I don't have to enter everything every time I run my application. So this and this. This simply reads a JSON file I have on my file system, and then creates a new team with the team name and team description, and then it iterates over the writers in the JSON file and creates a new writer for each of them. So let's see if that will work for us. And run app, and hopefully that will allow us to populate everything. And it probably will not, because there are one thing that is yes. I almost certainly know it will not run, because there's one thing that is Rails will automatically try to data bind the date in my JSON file, and that file has a date format that Grails does not recognize per default, but I could in my application.yaml file just add tell Grails how to data bind with more formats. So now it will know how to data bind all these formats when it's a date field. So, and I'm not sure why my machine is so slow starting up my Grails. That's very unfortunate. Well, while we wait for this one to start up and I have to stop it again, do you have any questions? If I want to put it into production? The database console? Oh, everything is, if you want to deploy this into production, you would usually do it on a Tomcat or some other container. And Grails simply has one command called war. So if you want to create a war file, you will write war, or you can do it in Gradle, and it will build a war file that you could deploy on a Tomcat, and it will contain everything you need to run the application in production. Yes, everything that file needs to be replaced with something else. It will deploy, it will run and look exactly as you have it in development mode. The only thing that there's a few things, like the database console is turned off, and the database connection will be the one that is defined in the production environment, and reloading is turned off. So, and it does something to optimize the running code, so it's not slowed down by things that you need in development. Yes, well, you could make some switch statements in your index file that asked if you're in production mode or not.
So whenever I select a controller or tag library, domain object, if I say new, it shows new grade domain object or something.
Yeah.
But as far as views is concerned, it doesn't show anything.
It doesn't show.
Create new grades view or something. It doesn't show.
No, it has a. I'm just going to get back to one final thing. Because we had the scaffolded view, and that doesn't show much of what's going on behind underneath the hood. There's also one called Generate All that will generate a controller with all the code that Grails normally do use for scaffolding, and it will create the views for us, so we can have those as a starting point.
So when you create a new controller, it does not automatically create a view for that?
Nope, not by
So
the.
how do you